Emily Cooper had always been a quiet force of resilience. At 42 years old, life had shaped her into a woman of quiet wisdom, someone who understood the value of hard work, kindness, and perseverance. A widow for nearly 5 years, she had one clear purpose: ensuring the well-being of her son, Tommy. At just 10 years old, Tommy faced the battle of his life, a congenital heart condition that left him fragile and often confined to hospital beds instead of playgrounds. Emily worked as a housekeeper in the sprawling mansion of Elon Musk, one of the wealthiest and busiest men in the world. His world was one of unimaginable luxury, where ideas shaped the future and wealth came faster than one could fathom. Emily's world was much smaller, days filled with cleaning rooms no one used, dusting shelves that housed books she couldn't imagine reading, and polishing floors that gleamed like mirrors. It was Thursday morning when it happened. Emily was alone in Mr. Musk's private office, methodically cleaning a glass-top desk and arranging files. Her movements were precise and quiet, her thoughts drifting to the doctor's appointment Tommy had the next day. That's when she heard it. A sharp, clipped voice, Elon's, carried through the room. He was pacing in the hallway just outside, phone pressed to his ear. "This dinner is absolutely crucial, John. If this deal doesn't close, we're looking at a huge setback for the company. I don't care if they're sharks. Play it smart, and we'll come out ahead." Emily froze, her hands still gripping a cloth, as she realized she'd overheard something important. Instinctively, she kept her head down and continued working, careful not to make a sound. She had become adept at being invisible in this house, and that's the way she liked it. When the muffled conversation faded, Emily sighed quietly, a mix of curiosity and sympathy in her chest. For all his wealth and brilliance, Mr. Musk sounded stressed, a reminder that even the mighty carried burdens. She shook her head, returning to her task. After all, what was the business of billionaires to someone like her? The day of the big dinner began like any other. Emily had already been awake since dawn, preparing Tommy's breakfast before sending him off to his grandmother's for the evening. Her boy had smiled at her that morning, a rare moment of brightness that lifted her heart even as her hands scrubbed tirelessly at countertops and laundry. By late afternoon, she found herself in the main sitting room of Mr. Musk's mansion, carefully rearranging the books on the towering mahogany shelves. She worked with the precision of someone who took pride in even the smallest task, her movements efficient and practiced. The room was quiet until the unmistakable sound of heavy, purposeful footsteps filled the air. Emily turned just in time to see Mr. Musk enter. He looked distracted, his brow furrowed as he scanned the room. "Elon," he muttered to himself under his breath before stopping and pinching the bridge of his nose. Then his gaze landed on her, an almost accidental discovery, like a man seeing a hidden object for the first time. "Emily." His voice, sharp and abrupt, made her stand up straighter. "Are you busy tonight?" Emily blinked, unsure she'd heard him correctly. "Tonight, sir." "Yes." He looked her up and down, though not unkindly, just curiously, as if trying to calculate something in his mind. "My assistant canceled last minute. An emergency. I need someone to accompany me to a business dinner. Are you free?" Emily's hands froze on the book she was holding, her heart skipping a beat. Surely he wasn't serious. I finish my work soon, Mr. Musk," she stammered, still unsure how to process the question. "But I'm not." "Good." He cut her off, his focus already elsewhere as he pulled his phone from his pocket. "You'll come with me." "Sir, I don't think I'm—" Emily's voice trailed off when Elon looked up again, his expression direct. "It's not a request, Emily," he said, though his tone lacked harshness. "I just need someone there. Someone who listens, understands what's happening, and won't cause a scene. That's all." Emily opened her mouth to protest again, but closed it just as quickly. The idea of saying no to Elon Musk seemed absurd. Her heart pounded uncomfortably as she struggled to make sense of what was happening. "I don't have anything to wear," she finally managed, her voice soft, as if trying to reason her way out of it. "Don't worry about that," Elon said briskly. "I'll have someone take care of it." Before Emily could say another word, he was already dialing on his phone, giving instructions to his staff. Within minutes, two members of Elon's personal team, a no-nonsense woman named Angela and a towering assistant named Cole, appeared at the room's entrance. "Get Emily ready for tonight," Elon instructed them before disappearing again, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Emily stood there, still as a statue, her mind racing. What just happened? What followed felt like something out of a dream. Angela and Cole led Emily through a whirlwind of preparation that she couldn't have stopped even if she tried. She was ushered into one of the guest suites, bigger than her entire apartment, and within minutes, a small team of stylists and assistants arrived. Wait, this isn't necessary," Emily tried to protest as someone began untying the apron from around her waist. "Honey," Angela said with a small smile, "if Mr. Musk says you need to be ready, you need to be ready. Trust me. Let us work." In no time, her hair was washed blow-dried and styled into soft, elegant waves that framed her face. Makeup brushes swept across her skin, transforming her features until she barely recognized herself. "You have amazing cheekbones," one of the stylists murmured, stepping back to admire their work. Then came the dress. When Angela unzipped the garment bag, Emily nearly gasped. It was a deep navy blue gown, simple yet stunning, with a fitted bodice and a flowy skirt that pooled softly at her feet. When she put it on, she felt like she was wearing someone else's life. Angela smiled warmly. "You look beautiful." Emily stared at her reflection, the discomfort swelling in her chest. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't belong at a place like that." Angela tilted her head, her expression softening. "Maybe you belong there more than you think." Emily didn't have time to respond before Cole appeared at the door. "Mr. Musk is waiting, ma'am." The words sounded foreign to Emily's ears. "Ma'am." She swallowed hard as Angela offered her a pair of silver heels. "Don't worry," Angela whispered as Emily slipped the shoes on. "Just be yourself." "Be myself," Emily thought bitterly. "How do I be myself when I'm somewhere I don't belong?" Minutes later, Emily found herself stepping into one of Elon Musk's sleek black cars. He was already inside, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke quietly to someone on the other end. He barely looked up as she climbed in, though when he finally noticed her, his eyes flickered with something, approval maybe, before he returned to his call. As the car pulled out of the driveway, Emily clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her nerves twisting like a knot. "Mr. Musk," she said softly after he ended his call. I don't know how to act at a dinner like this." Elon glanced at her briefly, his face calm and unreadable. "You don't need to act, Emily." She frowned. "But just be yourself," he said, returning his focus to his phone. "It'll be fine." Emily looked out the window as the city lights sped by, her heart pounding harder with each mile. How could she be herself when nothing about this moment felt real? What would Tommy say if he could see her now? The car glided to a stop in front of a towering building bathed in soft golden light, its entrance marked by marble columns and a stream of sharply dressed individuals filtering inside. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the driver opened her door, the sound of heels and chatter filling her ears. She hesitated for just a moment, her hands clutching the skirt of her dress. But then Elon stepped out first, unbothered and confident. "Let's go," he said simply, looking back at her. Emily followed, trying her best to appear calm, though her insides twisted like a fraying rope. The restaurant's foyer was opulent beyond anything she'd ever seen. Crystal chandeliers hung like clusters of stars. The polished floors reflected the glow of soft lighting, and waitstaff in perfectly pressed uniforms moved with precision. As they stepped through the entrance, heads turned. Emily felt their gazes latch onto her, some curious, others sharp with judgment. She caught the murmurs, low enough to be polite, but loud enough to sting. "Who's that?" One woman whispered behind her hand to her husband. "She doesn't look like she belongs," said another, a man whose gaze lingered on Emily a beat too long. Did Musk really bring a date? Emily kept her chin up, though her face burned. Her heels clicked against the marble, each sound a reminder of how foreign this world was to her. She felt like an intruder, a misplaced piece in a carefully curated scene. Elon, however, walked beside her as though nothing at all was out of place. "Good evening, Mr. Musk," a maitre d' greeted warmly, bowing his head slightly. "Your table is ready." "Thank you," Elon replied, his tone curt as always. He gestured for Emily to follow as the maitre d' led them through the restaurant. The dining room was even grander, round tables set with shining silverware, glasses that caught the light like prisms, and floral centerpieces so tall Emily was sure they were worth more than her monthly rent. Around those tables sat men and women who belonged to this world. Men in tailored suits, women in gowns that shimmered, their jewelry catching the glow of candlelight. Emily felt their eyes again, judging, questioning. At the far end of the room, a group of executives sat at a large table. As Elon approached, they stood to greet him, their voices ringing out in familiar tones of forced friendliness. "Elon, you made it," said Mr. Parker, a middle-aged man with silver hair and a smile that didn't quite meet his eyes. "We were beginning to think you wouldn't show." "I don't miss meetings that matter," Elon replied. Then he stepped aside slightly. "This is Emily Cooper." The name hung in the air, drawing a beat of silence. The smiles froze. A few glances were exchanged, quick, subtle looks that said everything Emily already knew they were thinking. "Who is she? Why is she here?" "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Cooper," Mr. Parker finally said, though his tone betrayed his curiosity. A few others murmured similar greetings, but their voices lacked warmth. Emily offered a small nod, her hands trembling just slightly as she clasped them together. As they sat down, Elon leaned toward her briefly. "Ignore them," he said quietly, his voice low but firm. Emily nodded, though it was easier said than done. She had never felt so conspicuous in her life. The table was large, surrounded by influential names she heard on the news, people who had more money in their wallets than she'd seen in her lifetime. Beside Elon, she felt impossibly small. The conversation began with an ease Emily couldn't comprehend. They spoke in the language of industry giants. Terms like projections, equity stakes, and disruptive innovations flowed as naturally as water. She sat quietly, trying her best to follow along, though most of it sailed far over her head. Occasionally, a stray glance would land on her, a subtle eyebrow raised or a condescending smile thrown her way. Emily kept her eyes down, focusing on the delicate china plate in front of her. "Can I get you anything, madam?" a waiter asked softly, breaking her from her thoughts. "Water, please," she replied quickly, her voice barely audible. Across the table, a blonde woman with diamond earrings the size of grapes leaned toward one of the men and whispered something. The man chuckled quietly, his eyes darting toward Emily. Elon, however, paid no mind to the whispers. He spoke with his usual blunt authority, his focus entirely on the deal they were there to secure. Emily couldn't help but admire the way he commanded the room. He looked unshakable, unlike her. Suddenly, Emily became aware of someone staring directly at her. It was a tall, thin man with slicked back hair and an expression that reeked of arrogance. "Mr. Hudson, Miss Cooper, isn't it?" Mr. Hudson said suddenly, his voice cutting across the table like a blade. The chatter dimmed as people turned to look at Emily. Her stomach clenched. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside her. "I don't think we've met before," he continued, his tone dripping with false politeness. "Forgive me, but what exactly is your role in Musk's team?" Emily froze. Around the table, a few people smirked, waiting for her to stumble over an answer. She could feel their judgment heavy in the air. Before she could respond, Elon's voice cut in like a thunderclap. "She's someone whose perspective I value," he said sharply, looking Hudson directly in the eye. "And that's all that matters." The room went silent. Hudson opened his mouth, as if to argue, but Elon's glare stopped him cold. Emily felt her cheeks flush with heat, but she managed to lift her head slightly, the faintest trace of a smile playing on her lips. The tension eased, and the conversations resumed, though Emily could feel the subtle shift in the room. For the first time that evening, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely out of place. The room buzzed with conversation, forks clinking softly against plates as waiters moved gracefully between tables. Despite the opulent surroundings and the weight of judgmental stares, Emily sat quietly, her hands neatly folded in her lap. She tried to keep her focus on the elegant centerpiece of lilies and greenery rather than the intimidating faces at the table. The business talk resumed quickly after Elon's sharp response to Mr. Hudson, but the tension lingered in the air like a ghost. Emily couldn't shake the feeling of eyes lingering on her, studying, doubting. She was used to being invisible, blending into the background with ease. But tonight, she felt as though she were standing in a spotlight she never asked for. Across the table, Mr. Parker swirled a wine in his glass, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who always felt in control. He flashed an exaggerated smile toward Elon. "Elon, you know as well as I do," Parker began, his voice smooth but with an edge, "that innovation doesn't come cheap. Everyone here agrees the risk on this deal is monumental. It's not for the faint of heart. Nothing worth doing ever is," Elon replied without hesitation, his tone sharp, his gaze unwavering. Parker chuckled and turned his gaze toward Emily. The air seemed to tighten around her chest. "Wouldn't you agree, Miss Cooper?" he asked, his voice laced with feigned politeness. "I'm sure you have an opinion." The table went silent. All heads turned toward Emily, who sat motionless, stunned that the attention had shifted to her. She felt the heat of their gazes, some curious, others amused, waiting for her to falter. Her heart thumped loudly in her ears. Emily started, her voice small, but she stopped herself. She felt every ounce of her discomfort in that moment, but she also felt something else, a quiet resolve. She thought of Tommy, his frail little body lying in a hospital bed, always fighting without complaint. She thought of the days she'd spent scrubbing floors and stretching pennies, knowing she had no choice but to keep going. Emily looked up and met Mr. Parker's gaze, her voice soft but steady. "Risk is part of everything, isn't it?" she said. "Whether you're running a company or raising a child, nothing meaningful comes without it. But the question isn't whether something is risky. The question is whether it's worth it." The table fell still. For a brief moment, the only sound was the faint clink of glasses being set down. Parker blinked, clearly not expecting a response like that. A smirk twitched at the corner of Elon's mouth as he watched the scene unfold. Mr. Hudson let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "Well said," he muttered sarcastically, though the tension in his voice was unmistakable. But others at the table seemed intrigued, their expressions shifting from skepticism to mild surprise. A woman sitting a few seats down leaned in slightly, her brow raised. "Where did you learn that, Miss Cooper?" Emily hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of her napkin. "I suppose life teaches you those things," she said honestly. "When you don't have much, you learn to focus on what matters most." A man near the far end of the table, Mr. Donovan, a venture capitalist with sharp features, nodded thoughtfully. "Pragmatic. I like that." The conversation slowly resumed, but Emily noticed the subtle change. The sharp edge of curiosity that had surrounded her earlier had softened. People weren't staring as harshly now, and a few had even offered her small nods of acknowledgement. She sank back into her chair with a quiet breath of relief. As the evening wore on, Emily remained mostly silent, listening carefully to the discussions around her. It wasn't that she didn't have thoughts. She just wasn't sure when or if she was supposed to speak. But as the conversation began to drift into more abstract topics, she found herself paying closer attention. "So what you're saying," one man, Mr. Whitman, mused, "is that the company's long-term goal hinges on creating solutions that haven't even been thought of yet." "Exactly," Elon replied, his tone firm. "We innovate or we stagnate. The biggest mistake is thinking the problems we face today require the same kind of thinking that created them." Mr. Parker chuckled again, his smugness returning. "Easy to say, Musk, when you have the resources you do. Most people can't think past their immediate circumstances." Emily looked up then, surprising even herself. "That's not true." The words escaped before she could stop them, and the table quieted once more. Emily's face flushed, but she pressed on, forcing herself to speak. "Some of the smartest people I've ever met were those who had nothing," she said. "They're forced to see the world differently because they have to, because survival depends on it." Mr. Whitman tilted his head, intrigued. "Like what?" Emily paused, searching for the right words. "My grandmother used to say that simple solutions are usually the best. She didn't have much money, but she could fix anything. Sewing torn clothes, patching holes in the roof, finding ways to make things last longer. She said the difference between success and failure is usually just a matter of perspective." The table was quiet for a moment. Elon turned slightly, studying Emily with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That's refreshing," Sarah Mitchell, a powerful investor with a no-nonsense demeanor, said finally. "Sometimes we get so tangled in complicated solutions that we forget to look for the simple ones." Elon's lips quirked upward into the faintest smile, his sharp gaze still lingering on Emily. The rest of the dinner continued, but something had shifted. Emily felt it. The subtle condescension she'd noticed earlier had lessened, replaced by something almost resembling respect. A few people even asked her direct questions, listening with genuine interest when she responded. She spoke quietly, never overstepping, but her calm, practical wisdom seemed to cut through the arrogance that filled the room. By the time the dinner plates had been cleared and glasses of wine were being poured, Emily felt less like an outsider and more like herself. She still didn't belong in their world, but maybe, just maybe, that didn't matter as much as she thought. As the waitstaff served dessert, Elon leaned toward her slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I told you to be yourself," he said, a flicker of approval in his tone. "It's working." Emily looked at him, surprised, before offering a small, genuine smile. "I guess so." For the first time that night, she allowed herself to relax. The dinner seemed to settle into a rhythm, the air warmer now than when Emily had first arrived. The conversations had softened, and while business still ruled the table, Emily could sense that her earlier words had made ripples, small ones, but enough to change how some people looked at her. She didn't feel invisible anymore, though a part of her still wished she could disappear back into the safety of her routine. As dessert plates were served, the group's attention shifted toward the deal at hand. Mr. Parker stood, glass in hand, commanding the room with the swagger of someone who had spent years climbing to the top. "Gentlemen and ladies," he added with a glance at Sarah Mitchell and Emily, though his tone dripped with insincerity, "this partnership hinges on trust. Musk's vision is grand, sure, but visions are a dime a dozen. What matters is execution." Elon leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable as ever, though his sharp eyes betrayed a quiet intensity. "Execution happens when good people collaborate," he replied. "I don't surround myself with cynics, Parker. I prefer people who can see possibilities." Mr. Parker laughed, clearly not backing down. "Possibilities don't pay the bills, Elon. Reality does." It was the kind of verbal sparring Emily had grown accustomed to overhearing in Elon's house. The unrelenting, high-stakes debates of powerful men. She kept quiet, content to observe. But then, as if on cue, trouble struck. Mr. Hudson, still nursing his bruised ego from earlier, reached across the table to grab his wine glass. Too quickly, in one fluid, disastrous motion, his arm knocked over a full glass of red wine, sending it cascading across the table toward the pile of documents Elon had laid out earlier. Chaos erupted. "Watch it, Hudson," someone barked, leaping up as wine began to pool across the tablecloth and spill onto chairs. "Move the papers," another voice shouted. Elon shot up from his seat, his expression darkening as a waiter scrambled to mop up the mess with crisp white cloths. But the damage was done. A stack of critical documents, charts, projections, contracts, now dripped with streaks of deep red, the ink already beginning to blur. "Great," Mr. Parker muttered, throwing his hands up. "Just great." Emily watched as everyone sprang into disorganized action, shouting for waiters, piling the ruined papers into a heap as though panic would somehow fix the problem. Her heart began to race, but not with nerves, with determination. It was the same feeling she got whenever Tommy dropped something fragile or when the washing machine flooded the kitchen back home. She recognized the moment for what it was, a mess that needed fixing. Without thinking, Emily stood. "Excuse me," she said quietly. No one noticed. "Let's just print new copies," Mr. Hudson snapped irritably. "The dinner's ruined anyway." Elon's jaw tightened. "Those documents were annotated. We need them. Tonight." Emily stepped forward. "If you'll let me—" "Not now, Miss Cooper," Mr. Parker said dismissively, waving a hand in her direction. That did it. Something in Emily snapped. "Enough," she said firmly, louder this time. The sound of her voice cut through the commotion, surprising everyone, including herself. All heads turned toward her. Even Elon looked slightly taken aback. With steady steps, she walked around the table and gently picked up the stack of wine-soaked documents. "Don't rub them," she said to a waiter still dabbing frantically at the papers. "You'll only make it worse." The room watched her, stunned, as she laid the papers flat on an empty chair. "Waitstaff, may I borrow a hairdryer?" she asked calmly, turning toward a nearby server. "Hairdryer?" Mr. Hudson scoffed, rolling his eyes. "We don't have time for—" "Trust me," Emily interrupted, looking straight at Elon. "It's faster than reprinting. You won't lose the notes." Elon's brow lifted, and after a beat, he nodded toward the waiter. "Get her what she needs." Within moments, a small hairdryer appeared, its cord hastily unwound. Emily knelt beside the chair, flicked it on, and began directing warm air over the papers, careful not to let the heat get too close. The room fell eerily silent as everyone watched her work. The red stains began to dry, and the ink, while smudged in some places, was mostly salvageable. Emily's movements were steady, her face calm, as though she'd done this 100 times before. In truth, she had, not with corporate contracts, but with Tommy's crayon drawings and soggy grocery lists saved from spills at home. What are you doing?" Sarah Mitchell asked finally, breaking the silence. "Something my grandmother taught me," Emily replied without looking up. "Wine spills can ruin paper, but the key is drying it quickly before the ink bleeds." A small murmur went around the table as realization dawned on their faces. Slowly, the panic began to ebb. Mr. Parker, who had been watching skeptically, leaned back in his chair, his expression half amused, half begrudging. "Well, I'll be damned." Emily stood up a few minutes later, holding the now dry stack of papers. She smoothed them carefully before handing them to Elon. "They're not perfect, but they'll do." Elon took the documents, flipping through them. The notes, though faintly smudged, were still legible. He looked at her with something Emily couldn't quite place, something like admiration. "You saved the evening," he said quietly, so only she could hear. Emily gave him a small, uncertain smile. Just a little common sense. Mr. Whitman let out a low whistle. "Quick thinking, Ms. Cooper. Remind me not to underestimate you again." Sarah Mitchell nodded in agreement, her sharp gaze softening as it settled on Emily. "You kept your head when the rest of us didn't. That's rare." Even Mr. Hudson, though reluctant, muttered, "Good work," though his voice held the bitterness of someone who didn't like being proven wrong. Emily returned to her seat, her cheeks flushing slightly as the attention turned back to the deal itself. Elon glanced at her once more, this time with a small, genuine smile. "You've got a knack for saving the day, Emily," he said quietly. "I just fix what I can," she replied simply. And as the dinner carried on, Emily couldn't help but feel, for the first time that evening, like she belonged, maybe not in their world, but at that table, in that moment. The energy around the table had shifted. Where there had once been skepticism and cold judgment, there now lingered a faint undercurrent of respect. Emily could feel it, a subtle acknowledgement that perhaps she wasn't as out of place as they had initially assumed. Elon, too, seemed more relaxed, his sharp demeanor softening ever so slightly as he continued the negotiations. Dessert plates were cleared, replaced by glasses of champagne and cups of espresso. The evening seemed to be winding down, the tension of the earlier spill now a distant memory. Emily allowed herself to exhale, sinking back into her seat. She felt a flicker of relief. She had survived. But relief, she'd learned, often came too soon. Mr. Hudson, who had been conspicuously quiet since the incident, leaned back in his chair and looked directly at Emily. His thin lips curled into a smirk that made her stomach tighten. "Well, Miss Cooper," he drawled, loud enough to grab the attention of everyone at the table. "I must say, you've had quite the evening. Quick thinking with the documents and a few impressive quips. You've done well. For a housekeeper." The words dropped like a stone into a still pond. Emily froze. The champagne glass she had just picked up hovered midair, her fingers tightening around the stem. Around the table, the reactions varied. Sarah Mitchell's lips thinned into a hard line, Mr. Parker chuckled awkwardly, and others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Elon's gaze snapped toward Hudson, his jaw clenching ever so slightly. Hudson wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his tone laced with mock curiosity. "Tell me, Mr. Musk, is this the new strategy? Bringing the help to business dinners? Is that where you're finding your inspiration these days?" A cold hush fell over the room. Emily's face burned as if someone had struck a match against her skin. She looked down, instinctively shrinking into herself, her mind scrambling for something, anything, to say. The earlier moments of quiet triumph unraveled in an instant, leaving her exposed. She thought of Tommy, of his smile when he saw her off earlier that morning. What would he think if he could see her now? Small, humiliated, powerless. "Hudson," Elon's voice cut through the silence like a knife, low and dangerous. The room seemed to hold its breath. Mr. Hudson leaned back in his chair, a smug look on his face. "Relax, Elon," he said dismissively, waving a hand. "I'm just saying what we're all thinking. Surely someone of your status could have found a better dinner companion. A housekeeper. Really?" Elon stood. The movement was sudden, sharp. His chair scraped against the marble floor, and everyone at the table turned to stare. Elon Musk wasn't known for displays of emotion, which made the moment all the more startling. His piercing gaze locked onto Hudson, and his voice, though calm, carried a force that reverberated through the room. "Watch your mouth, Hudson." Hudson's smirk faltered. "I didn't." "No," Elon cut him off, his tone hard as steel. "You did, and you've embarrassed yourself." He gestured toward Emily, who sat frozen, her cheeks still flushed. "Emily has shown more intelligence, poise, and resourcefulness tonight than you have in years of sitting at this table. Pretending your arrogance is competence." The room was deathly quiet. Hudson's face turned crimson, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for a defense. Elon wasn't finished. "If you're too small-minded to recognize wisdom because it doesn't come wrapped in a designer suit, that's your failure, not hers." Emily lifted her eyes then, stunned by his words. Elon looked at the table, his gaze sweeping over the rest of the group. "If anyone else shares Hudson's opinion, feel free to leave now. I don't do business with people who measure worth by appearance." No one moved. Hudson looked away, muttering something under his breath. But the damage was done. His earlier confidence had been shattered. Elon turned toward Emily, his voice softening slightly. "You don't owe anyone here an explanation." She nodded faintly, her chest tight, though a strange warmth swelled within her. She couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken up for her like that. After a beat, Sarah Mitchell cleared her throat, breaking the tension. "Well said, Elon," she remarked coolly, shooting a sharp glance at Hudson. "It's a shame not everyone here understands the value of fresh perspectives." Several others murmured their agreement, and slowly, the table returned to something resembling normal. Conversations resumed, though with a more subdued energy. Mr. Hudson stayed quiet, his earlier arrogance replaced by silence. Elon sat back down beside Emily, his expression calm once more, as though the moment had never happened. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, his voice low, so no one else could hear. Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," she whispered, though her heart was still pounding. "Good," Elon said, glancing at her with a small, reassuring nod. You handled that better than most people I know. Emily managed a faint smile, though her mind was still racing. She had never expected Elon Musk, to defend her, let alone in front of people like this. And as the dinner continued, something shifted deep inside her. For the first time in a very long time, Emily Cooper felt seen. The tension from Mr. Hudson's outburst lingered faintly in the air, but something else had replaced it. A shift so subtle that Emily could hardly believe it. The quiet murmurs at the table no longer felt dismissive or mocking. Instead, there was a sense of curiosity, almost reverence, directed toward her. She had felt invisible at the start of the evening, but now every glance, every nod, seemed to acknowledge that she was more than they had assumed. Emily sat still, keeping her hands neatly folded in her lap, her heart still settling from Elon's unexpected defense of her. Across the table, Sarah Mitchell, one of the evening's most influential figures, gave her an appraising look. Sarah was a formidable woman in her mid-50s, known for her cool logic and ability to see through facades. She had spent the entire dinner quietly observing Emily, like someone trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, Sarah leaned forward, her sharp gaze fixed on Emily. "Emily, may I ask you something?" Emily looked up quickly, startled. "Of course," she replied softly, though she could feel the heat rising to her cheeks again. Sarah's voice was clear and commanding, drawing everyone's attention. "You said earlier that simple solutions are often the best. I've been sitting here thinking about that. What do you think we, as business leaders, miss when we focus on the big picture? When we complicate things?" All eyes turned to Emily again. It was a different kind of attention this time, less judgmental, more intrigued. Even Elon glanced sideways at her, clearly interested in her answer. Emily swallowed, suddenly aware of how quiet the table had grown. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I think sometimes the big picture can blind us to the small details," she began, choosing her words carefully. "You all build amazing things, things that change the world, but sometimes problems don't need complex solutions. They need someone who's willing to look at them with fresh eyes." She glanced at Sarah, then at Mr. Parker, who now seemed genuinely interested rather than dismissive. "When I clean, I see everything, every speck of dust, every corner most people ignore. It's the little things that make the difference. If you ignore them too long, the mess builds up, and suddenly it's not so small anymore." The table remained quiet for a moment before Sarah let out a low, impressed hum. "You know, Miss Cooper, I've sat through more board meetings than I care to count, and I don't think I've heard it put better than that." Mr. Donovan, the venture capitalist, nodded. "She's right. Sometimes we get so fixated on the bigger picture we overlook what's right in front of us." Elon didn't say anything, but his faint smile spoke volumes. Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying Emily with newfound respect. "You're a sharp woman, Emily," she said. "People like you remind us of what matters most. Sometimes the simple truths are the ones we need to hear the most." Emily blinked, stunned. Sharp woman. No one had ever called her that before. "Here's to fresh perspectives," Sarah said, lifting her champagne glass slightly. "To fresh perspectives," Mr. Parker echoed, clinking his glass against Sarah's. Around the table, others murmured agreement, and the soft clink of glasses meeting filled the air. Emily, feeling like she was floating outside her own body, watched as these powerful people acknowledged her, really acknowledged her, for the first time. As the table returned to conversation, Elon turned to her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You're doing more than fine, Emily." Emily smiled faintly, a flutter of pride rising in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. As the evening carried on, Emily found herself approached by Sarah Mitchell during a quiet lull. Sarah stood beside her as they waited for the valet to pull up the cars, her sharp demeanor softening into something more personal. "You know," Sarah said, tilting her head toward Emily, "I started out in a diner. Waitressing tables." Emily turned, surprised. "You did?" Sarah nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "People used to look at me the same way they looked at you tonight, like I didn't belong, like I couldn't possibly understand their world. She met Emily's gaze, her voice softening. But the thing is, Emily, you don't have to be born into their world to be part of it. Sometimes people like us see things they miss entirely. Emily stared at her, feeling the weight of Sarah's words settle deep inside her. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Sarah smiled warmly. "Don't let anyone make you feel small. You have more value than most people at that table combined." Emily was still absorbing her words when Elon appeared at her side, his expression as calm and collected as ever. "Car's ready," he said to her. Emily turned to Sarah. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Ms. Mitchell." "The pleasure was mine," Sarah replied, her eyes glinting with something Emily could only describe as approval. "Take care, Emily. And don't forget what I said." As the sleek black car pulled away from the restaurant, Emily sat in silence, the evening replaying in her mind. She glanced out the window at the city, lights blurring past, feeling as though she had stepped into someone else's life. The luxury, the sharp suits, the delicate wine glasses, it was all so far removed from her world. And yet, somehow, she had been there. She had sat at that table. She had spoken, and people had listened. "You did well tonight," Elon said suddenly, breaking the silence. Emily turned to look at him, his face illuminated by the faint glow of his phone screen. "I didn't really do anything," she said softly. "I just spoke my mind." Elon glanced at her then, his gaze sharp yet kind. "That's exactly why you stood out." Emily looked back out the window, her lips curving into a small, thoughtful smile. She didn't belong in Elon Musk's world, not really. But tonight had shown her something she hadn't known before. Maybe the value of her voice was greater than she'd ever imagined. The drive back to Elon Musk's mansion was cloaked in silence. Outside the car window, the city sparkled, 1,000 windows glowing against the night sky, each one a different life, a different story. Emily sat quietly, still replaying the evening in her mind. For the first time in years, she felt as though her voice had carried weight, real weight. Yet the truth remained. She was a housekeeper, a widow, a mother barely keeping her son's future intact. She glanced at Elon sitting beside her. He was typing something on his phone, his expression focused and unreadable as usual. The events of the evening seemed to roll off him like rain on a windshield. But for Emily, it had been a storm she would never forget. Finally, the car pulled into the long, winding driveway of the mansion. The house loomed ahead, a symbol of wealth and innovation, so far removed from her small, worn-down apartment. The driver opened the door and Emily stepped out, still feeling the ache in her feet from wearing heels she wasn't used to. Elon followed, his phone still in his hand. "Good night, Emily," he said simply, his tone brisk, as though everything had already been neatly filed away in his mind. Emily nodded. "Good night, Mr. Musk." As he walked ahead, disappearing into the vastness of his home, Emily lingered for a moment at the base of the steps. The night air was cool, and the mansion's exterior lights glowed warmly. But that moment of stillness was broken by the sharp ring of her phone in her small purse. Emily's heart sank. She knew what it was before she even saw the name on the screen. Grandma. Her mother-in-law rarely called unless something was wrong. Emily's hand shook slightly as she picked up. "Hello, Emily." Her mother-in-law's voice sounded strained. "It's Tommy." His heart started acting up again. The world tilted. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "What? How bad is it?" "We're at the hospital now. The doctors are running tests, but they said you should come." Emily's knees almost buckled, but she gripped the edge of the stone railing, steadying herself. "I'm on my way," she said quickly. "I'll be there soon." The call ended, and Emily was left standing alone beneath the grand shadow of Elon Musk's mansion. All the confidence she'd gained during the dinner seemed to vanish, replaced by a familiar, suffocating fear. Tommy, her boy, the one thing she couldn't lose. She turned quickly, her heels clacking against the stone steps as she ran back toward the garage where Elon's fleet of cars was kept. One of his assistants, Angela, stood near the entrance, holding a tablet and looking surprised at Emily's sudden urgency. "Angela, please," Emily said breathlessly, her voice shaking. "I need a ride to the hospital." Angela frowned. "The hospital? What happened?" "My son. He's sick. I need to go now." Angela's expression softened. "Of course. I'll call you a car." But Emily didn't have time to wait for a car service. "No, please. I need something now." At that moment, Elon's voice cut through the night. "What's going on?" Emily turned to see him standing just outside the grand entrance, watching her with a mix of curiosity and concern. She didn't care about appearances anymore. She couldn't. "It's Tommy," she said, her voice breaking. "My son. He's at the hospital, and I need to get to him." Elon studied her for only a second before nodding. "Come with me." In minutes, Emily found herself in Elon's private Tesla, the soft hum of the engine barely audible as the car glided through the city streets at a speed that matched the urgency in her chest. Elon drove himself, focused and calm, his hands steady on the wheel. "You didn't have to do this," Emily whispered, her voice tight as she clutched her purse to her chest. "You needed to get there quickly," Elon replied matter-of-factly. "That's all there is to it." Emily looked out the window, the city blurring past in streaks of light. Her thoughts raced alongside the car. Please let him be okay. Please, God, let Tommy be okay. After what felt like an eternity, they pulled up to the hospital entrance. Emily didn't wait for the car to come to a full stop before she was out the door, running through the sliding glass entrance. "Tommy Cooper." She gasped to the nurse at the front desk. The nurse nodded sympathetically. "Room 308, third floor." Emily barely heard the rest before she sprinted to the elevator, her heart pounding as she rode up, floor by floor. When the doors opened, she saw her mother-in-law, a small, gray-haired woman, sitting outside the room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Where is he?" Emily managed to say as she approached. Her mother-in-law stood and pulled Emily into a hug. "He's stable, Emily." They caught it in time. Tears blurred Emily's vision as she let out a choked breath. "Can I see him?" Her mother-in-law nodded. "Go. He's asking for you." Inside the room, Tommy lay in a hospital bed, looking smaller than ever, his face pale against the stark white pillow. His small chest rose and fell steadily, wires and monitors keeping track of his fragile heart. When he turned his head and saw her, a faint smile appeared on his lips. "Mom," he whispered. Emily rushed to his side, taking his little hand in hers. "Hey, baby, I'm here," she said softly, brushing his hair back. "Did you have a good dinner?" he asked weakly. Emily let out a shaky laugh through her tears. "It was interesting. Did you say something smart?" Tommy grinned faintly. She smiled, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "I tried." At that moment, she heard the door creak open behind her. Turning her head, she was shocked to see Elon Musk standing there, his tall figure awkwardly out of place in the small hospital room. He nodded politely at her mother-in-law before meeting Emily's stunned gaze. "I wanted to make sure everything was okay," he said simply. Emily blinked, struggling to find the right words. "He's stable. Thank you for helping me get here." Elon nodded again and glanced at Tommy, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Your mom's a very impressive woman, you know," he said quietly. Tommy smiled faintly. "She's the smartest person I know." Elon looked at Emily then, and for once, she didn't see the aloof businessman or the tech genius. She just saw a man who, in his own way, understood the value of moments like this. "If you need anything, Emily," he said softly, "you let me know." Emily stared at him, unable to hide her surprise. "Thank you," she whispered. As Elon turned to leave, Emily looked down at Tommy, his hand still tucked in hers. She realized in that moment that no matter how out of place she might have felt in Elon Musk's world, her place in this world, with her son, was all that truly mattered. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. The sun had barely begun to rise when Emily returned home. The soft glow of dawn filtered through the windows of her small, tidy apartment. Tommy was resting comfortably under his grandmother's watchful eye after the doctors confirmed he was stable, though they'd advised another procedure would soon be needed. Emily sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, staring blankly at the wall as exhaustion weighed on her like a stone. What a night. She still couldn't wrap her head around everything that had happened. The luxurious dinner, the sharp words thrown her way, the moment when Elon Musk himself defended her, and finally, his quiet act of kindness when he drove her to the hospital without hesitation. It was like something out of a dream, a strange, surreal dream she hadn't asked to be part of. The sound of her phone vibrating against the table broke through her thoughts. Emily picked it up, frowning slightly when she saw an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. After a moment's hesitation, she answered, "Hello, Emily Cooper." The voice on the other end was clear, sharp, and unmistakably familiar. "Yes," Emily replied cautiously. "Who is this?" "It's Sarah Mitchell," the voice said with the same calm authority that had drawn Emily's respect the night before. "I hope I'm not calling too early." Emily sat up straighter, surprise jolting her awake. "No, not at all," she said quickly. "Good morning, Ms. Mitchell." There was a pause. "How's your son?" Emily blinked, caught off guard by the question. "He's stable. Thank you for asking. The doctors say he'll need more care, but he's okay for now." "I'm glad to hear that." Sarah's tone was softer than Emily expected, though still composed. "I've been thinking about you all night, Emily. About what you said." Emily frowned slightly. "What I said? About the small details," Sarah clarified. "About how fresh perspectives often solve problems the rest of us overlook. You made an impression last night. On me. And I suspect on others too. That's not easy to do in a room full of egos." Emily felt a flush rise to her cheeks even though no one could see her. "I didn't mean to. I was just trying to help." That's exactly why it worked. There was a brief pause, and Emily heard papers shuffling on Sarah's end of the line. "I don't normally make calls like this, but I'm someone who knows value when I see it. I think you're wasted as a housekeeper, Emily." Emily froze. "What?" Sarah chuckled softly. "You heard me. You have a sharp mind and an instinct for seeing solutions where others see problems. I've seen it before in people who've climbed their way up from nothing. If you'd be willing to learn, I think you'd have a place in my company, maybe as an assistant to start or something in operations." Emily couldn't breathe for a moment. Her heart pounded in her chest as Sarah's words sank in. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "I don't have experience. I've never worked in an office before. I didn't have experience either when I started waiting tables at 16, Sarah said firmly. "Experience can be taught. Instinct can't. You have that, and it's rare." Emily was silent, her mind spinning. It felt like too much, like a door being opened to a world she wasn't ready for. But then she thought of Tommy. She thought of the hospital bills piling up on her kitchen counter, the doctor's quiet warnings that another surgery might be necessary soon. She thought of the look on his face the night before, how fragile he'd looked under the harsh hospital lights. And suddenly, the door Sarah Mitchell was offering didn't seem so impossible after all. "Ms. Mitchell," Emily said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Thank you. I need to think about it." "But thank you. Take your time," Sarah replied. "But don't take too long, Emily. Opportunities like this don't knock twice." Later that morning, as Emily sat beside Tommy's bed at the hospital, she couldn't stop replaying Sarah's words in her head. "You're wasted as a housekeeper." Could it be true? Could she really have a future beyond what she had always known? "Mom." Tommy's small voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to him quickly, smoothing his hair back. "I'm here, baby. What is it?" He looked at her with those bright, trusting eyes of his. "Did you say something smart last night?" Emily smiled faintly, her heart swelling with love for him. "I did my best," she said softly. Tommy grinned. "I knew you would." As she sat there, watching him drift back to sleep, Emily made a silent promise to herself. Whatever it took, whether she stayed in her job or dared to take the risk Sarah Mitchell had offered, she would give Tommy the future he deserved. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. The following morning, sunlight poured through the thin curtains of Emily's small apartment. She awoke to the gentle hum of her phone vibrating on the nightstand. For a moment, she lingered in that hazy space between sleep and reality, her mind drifting back to Elon Musk's words the day before: "You were a housekeeper yesterday. Who you are tomorrow is up to you." The phone buzzed again, pulling her fully into the day. Emily reached for it, blinking against the light. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but after the past few days, nothing surprised her anymore. She answered cautiously. "Hello." "Good morning, Miss Cooper," said a calm, professional voice. "This is Angela, Mr. Musk's assistant. I hope I didn't wake you." "No," Emily said quickly, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. "Not at all. How can I help you?" "I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Musk," Angela replied. "He asked me to deliver a message and ensure everything is taken care of. You'll find an email in your inbox shortly, but in the meantime, I'll explain." Emily frowned, her heartbeat picking up. "An email? Okay. Mr. Musk has made arrangements for your son's medical care," Angela said, her tone gentle yet efficient. "All of Tommy's upcoming treatments and procedures have been covered. He'll receive care from the best specialists available." Emily froze. The words seemed to hang in the air, too impossible to grasp. I don't understand," she stammered. "Mr. Musk believes no one should have to fight alone," Angela continued. "He wanted you to focus on your son, not on the costs." Tears sprang to Emily's eyes, a lump forming in her throat so quickly she couldn't speak. She gripped the edge of the blanket, as though holding on to something solid would help her stay grounded. "Additionally," Angela continued, her voice breaking through Emily's haze, "there's an offer letter in your inbox. Mr. Musk would like you to join his operations team. It's an entry-level position with on-the-job training, but he believes your perspective will add value to the company." The room seemed to tilt. Emily stared blankly at the far wall, her mind spinning as she tried to process what she just heard. Angela paused, as if sensing Emily's shock. "Take your time reviewing the details. There's no pressure, Ms. Cooper. Mr. Musk simply wanted you to know the opportunity is there." Emily's voice cracked. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything right now," Angela replied kindly. "Just check your inbox when you're ready. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to call." The call ended, leaving Emily sitting motionless on the edge of her bed. Slowly, she set the phone down and walked to the small desk in the corner of her room where her ancient laptop sat. Her hands trembled as she opened it, waiting for the sluggish device to power on. Finally, her inbox loaded, and there it was, a subject line that made her heart skip. From the desk of Elon Musk. She clicked it, her eyes scanning the contents. "Dear Emily, I wanted to personally extend this offer to you, not out of charity, but because I believe in what you bring to the table. Your ability to see solutions where others see problems is rare, and I have no doubt you'll find ways to make an impact beyond what you can imagine. The operations team is where we fix what's broken and make systems better. That's where you belong. If you accept this offer, you'll be given training, mentorship, and the opportunity to grow. As for Tommy, his care is covered. Consider it an investment, not in me, but in you and your future. Take your time, but know this. Sometimes life opens doors you didn't know were there. All you have to do is step through. Sincerely, Elon Musk." Emily's hand flew to her mouth as the tears spilled freely. She pressed her forehead to the desk, overwhelmed by a wave of gratitude so powerful it made her chest ache. For so long, her life had been about surviving, day to day, paycheck to paycheck, moment to moment. Tommy's illness had been the constant shadow she couldn't escape, no matter how hard she worked. And now, in one extraordinary act, someone had lifted that weight. Not just the financial burden, but something deeper. The belief that she was more than her circumstances, that she deserved a chance to be something more. Hours later, Emily sat by Tommy's side at the hospital again, holding his hand while he slept. She stared at his peaceful face, the faint rise and fall of his chest steady and strong. Her mother-in-law entered quietly and sat beside her. "Emily, you look different today," she said softly. "What's happened?" Emily smiled faintly, brushing a tear from her cheek. Someone saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. Her mother-in-law tilted her head, clearly puzzled. Emily turned to her, her voice steady and full of quiet determination. I think I've been given a chance, a real chance to change things. Not just for me, but for Tommy, for us. Her mother-in-law squeezed her arm gently, pride shining in her eyes. Then take it, Emily. You deserve it. That evening, Emily sat at her small kitchen table again, the glow of her laptop lighting the room. She hovered over the reply button to Elon Musk's email, her heart pounding in her chest. Finally, she typed the words that would change her life. Dear Mr. Musk, thank you for believing in me. I accept. Best, Emily Cooper. She hit send and leaned back in her chair, tears still brimming in her eyes as a small, hopeful smile crept across her face. For the first time in years, Emily felt something she hadn't dared to feel. Hope. Hope that her son would get better. Hope that her hard work had not been in vain. Hope that she could become someone she had never imagined. And as the room settled into a quiet calm, she whispered to herself, sometimes life does open doors. 2 weeks later, Emily found herself standing in front of the towering glass doors of Musk Industries, the morning sun reflecting brilliantly off the polished facade. She had never seen a building like it up close, and the sheer scale made her breath catch. Adjusting the plain but neatly pressed blazer she'd borrowed from her mother-in-law, Emily inhaled deeply. This was it, the beginning of something entirely new. Inside, the hum of activity was immediate. Polished professionals moved purposefully through the vast, airy lobby. A receptionist at the desk greeted her warmly. You must be Miss Cooper, she said with a smile. Welcome. Mr. Musk has arranged for someone from operations to show you around. Emily managed a nod, her nerves bubbling beneath the surface. Thank you. The sleek elevator ride to the upper floors felt surreal. With each passing moment, Emily could almost feel her life changing, like a ship finally shifting course. Elon Musk had seen something in her when no one else had. He had opened a door to a future she hadn't even dared to dream about. The elevator doors slid open, and a young man in a crisp shirt approached her. Miss Cooper, I'm Daniel. I'll get you settled into your orientation. Mr. Musk mentioned you'd bring a lot of insight to the team. Emily blinked, caught off guard. He said that. Daniel grinned. Elon doesn't say things he doesn't mean. We're lucky to have you. Those words echoed in her mind as Daniel led her through the bright, bustling floor, introducing her to people who shook her hand without a hint of condescension. Emily, who had spent years being invisible, felt seen in a way that was entirely new. That evening, after her first day on the job, Emily stopped by the hospital to see Tommy. She walked into his room, carrying a small bouquet of bright yellow daisies she'd picked up from a vendor on the way, something cheerful to brighten his space. Tommy's face lit up when he saw her. Mom, you're smiling. Emily laughed softly as she sat down beside him, brushing his hair back with gentle fingers. Maybe I am. Did you do something smart again? He asked teasingly, though his voice was still thin and tired. Emily grinned, her heart swelling as she looked at him. I'm trying, sweetheart. Did you wear the fancy shoes again? This made her laugh outright, a real laugh that filled the small room. Not today, but maybe someday, when you're out of here, we can both wear fancy shoes and go somewhere special. Tommy's smile widened. Promise. I promise, she said, squeezing his small hand in hers. For the first time in a long time, Emily could see the pieces of a brighter future coming together. A steady job with the possibility of growth, a boss who believed in her, and, most importantly, the knowledge that Tommy would get the care he needed. A week later, as Emily sat in the quiet corner of the Musk Industries break room, she received an unexpected message on her phone. It was an email from Elon Musk. She opened it quickly, her pulse quickening. Subject: Thank you. Emily, I wanted to let you know how much I appreciate your perspective and insight. You reminded me of something simple but often overlooked. Solutions aren't always about complexity. They're about clarity. People like you make businesses and the world better. Keep going. I have no doubt you'll surprise us all. Elon tears pricked at the corners of Emily's eyes as she read the short message. She held the phone tightly in her hands, her heart swelling with something unfamiliar but welcome pride. She looked out the window, watching the city bustle below, and whispered, as though speaking to her younger self, the woman who had scrubbed floors and kept her head down for so many years. Sometimes life takes you to places you never expected, and maybe that's where you're meant to be all along.